It seems like whenever I get into a conversation with anybody about the original NES, the topic that always seems to come up is, what are some good games that we haven't played before? People that play the NES are all familiar with the classics, but are always in search of games deep within the depths of the NES library that are worth their time to play. We all know the NES had a lot of junk titles, so it can be hard to sift through the crap to find the good ones. After helping to write reviews for years, I've become very familiar with the entire NES catalog, and I've found a bunch of great games that people never seem to even mention. So let's get started. It's Cinemassacre's Top 10 Obscure NES Gems. Number 10. Here's an NES game that's right up my alley, Felix the Cat. Felix the Cat was the most popular cartoon character of the silent era of animation. Before Mickey tooted his horn in Steamboat Willie, Felix was tearing up the silver screen with his detachable tail and magic bag. He was the first character to have a big following, so it's only right that eventually he got his own video game. And you know, before I played this, I would have put money on it sucking mouse turds, but I would have gone broke because this is actually a pretty solid game. Now, Felix had a cartoon series in 1995 called The Twisted Tales of Felix the Cat, but the magic bag and the professor that appear in the game were from the 1950s TV cartoon. So the NES game is based on a mix of the silent era character and the 50s cartoon. For an NES game, the graphics are good, and for me, the controls are perfect. But the thing that makes this game stand out are the awesome power-ups. You collect these little circles with Felix's face on them. Some give off milk bottles and others give off hearts. The hearts will give you all sorts of new abilities, like becoming a tank, a plane, a hot air balloon, or a cat submarine, to name a few. And the milk will charge up your heart meter, allowing you to keep the special ability for a longer period of time. The game's fairly easy. I beat it the first time I played it, and after you get the strongest power-up, any other heart you get after that will just become a 1-up. You collect those so rapidly, it makes the game hard to lose. And on some levels, you can just fly right over everything. Kinda like certain stages in Super Mario World where you can just use the cape to fly above the level. So that's my only minor complaint. It is a little too easy. It could have used a difficulty setting. But other than that, it's a lot of fun. And it's a shame that it was so overlooked, because it's sure a hell of a lot better than Ghostbusters and Top Gun, which every kid was duped into buying. Since it may be a while before anybody makes Epic Felix, go ahead and try out the NES game in the meantime. Number 9. Crazy Creatures. Here we have an unlicensed puzzle game called Crazy Creatures. On the surface, the game looks really stupid. It's got a bunch of cats and dogs and even pink elephants like in Dumbo. You're probably gonna think I'm out of my mind to choose this for the list, but you'll have to trust me on this one. The reason I like it is because of the gameplay. It's really good. It was released in 1990 and was made by American Video Entertainment, which also published Wally Bear and the No Gang. I know, it doesn't look too promising. So this game is pretty dull with the graphics, but it's a lot of fun. It's really all about the gameplay. You go from stage to stage, matching up groups of animals, which remove them from the screen. It's a very simplistic game. It's a race against the clock to try and clear the whole screen. If the entire screen does fill up with animals, the game will be over, so you're gonna have to work fast. And it gets really intense, which is, I guess, why it's called Crazy Creatures. What makes it fun is when you get a really long row, or if you clear the screen right before the timer runs out. It gives you a real sense of accomplishment when you do really well. With this one, you really just have to play it yourself to see what I mean. It's a lot of fun and I like it. So let's move on. Number 8, Joe and Mac. In this game, you play as 2 cavemen and you have to save cave girls from other cavemen. If you win, they all get together and watch Captain Caveman on the television. No, that part I made up. It was originally an arcade game, and of course the graphics aren't as good as in the original arcade, but the gameplay is still there. I will say this about the graphics though, it's one of the few NES games that I remember where the background images move by the camera slower than the foreground images, and it created a nice illusion of depth that you didn't get too often with the NES. The music's also good, you get a few catchy, memorable tunes. You get a few different weapons to choose from, the basic axe, stone wheels, and boomerangs. I think the best one is the stone wheel. It seems to do more damage than the axe, and you can throw it further than the boomerang. I'm putting this lower on the list because unfortunately it's not 2 players at the same time. Player 2 has to wait. And some of the boss battles are too difficult, like the giant Venus flytrap where they give you nowhere to stand, so you usually get eaten. Still though, a few minor flaws aside, this is a really good NES game and it's often passed by. Number 7, Zexes. Gee, I wonder why this game wasn't that popular. Let's see. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that it's called Zexes. I didn't even know how to pronounce the name of the game for a long time until I actually heard somebody say it. It's a shame that the title's so bad, because if they would have named it something else, it might have been more well known, and the game deserves it. It has 3 styles of gameplay: side-scrolling, platforming, and shooter stages. That really helps prevent the game from getting overly monotonous. Though even with all the variety, I'll admit, once you start getting to the later stages, it does seem to become the same thing over and over. You don't just go from left to right blasting stuff, no, there's more to it. You have to find hidden rooms and defeat mini-bosses that give you this thing called a Force Star. That allows you to access another part of the island called the Mechanic's Castle, where you'll find the level's boss. Also, along the way are shops and characters that give hints, which usually aren't that much help. One guy tells you to kill the boss, you need to hit him in the eye. Wow, I never would have guessed. There's also fairies and hot tubs that need your help. Wow, this game is weird. What's also weird is this bonus area, where to open the treasure chest, you have to hit a ghost with your head and knock it into the chest above. I think the designers were on drugs. There is a nice variety of weapons and abilities that you can acquire as you play, like being able to walk on air or the ability to clone yourself, so that you have twice the firepower. You can also turn into a tornado and kill enemies just like the Tasmanian Devil. It kinda sucks though because the weapons don't last for very long. At the end of each shooter or platforming section, there's a different boss to fight. They usually move in predictable patterns, and they range in difficulty. One thing that I don't like is when you have to choose doors. When you play inside the mechanics' castles, you ride on vehicles shooting things while the screen scrolls. At the end of each one of these, they make you pick a door to advance. If you pick the wrong door, you have to do the section over again. I think that's pretty cheap, and it just wastes your time. It's like putting all your money on red at the roulette table and then having it come up black. Why include that in a game like this? It's a fantasy adventure, not a casino. If you beat the game, they'll give you 2 passwords. One password lets you go through the whole game with the side-scroller levels only, and the other password lets you do the shooter levels only. Kinda cool if you prefer one over the other, and at least they reward you with something where many other games don't. It's not the best game on the NES by any means, but it's pretty good. Lots of variety and a large, interesting world. It deserves more praise than it got. Number 6, New Ghostbusters 2. This is by far the best Ghostbusters game released on the NES. It had all the characters you could want, and it had great gameplay. I recently did a video called Ghostbusters Leftovers where I did a full review on the entire game, so I'm not going to go into any more detail. If you want to know more, just check out that review. It's a game that should be included in every NES collector's library. Number 5, Clash at Demon Head. You play as a guy named Bang, and your goal is to stop a bomb on the top of Death Head Mountain from exploding, or else it'll destroy the world. Not only that, but there's an evil demon that's trying to prevent him from defusing the bomb. Instead of the typical game where you go from stage to stage in a linear order, here, after you complete an area, you're taken to a map screen where you can choose your route. And depending on which way you go, you find different things to aid you in your quest. Some routes lead to dead ends, while others lead to stores, items, and weapons that you need to complete your mission. You travel along side-scroller style, and you kill enemies for money. You can use the money at a shop, which is something Bang can call, and it appears out of the sky. How weird is that? Imagine if you wanted a package of soda and a 7-Eleven appeared out of the sky. That's NES logic for you. In the store, you can buy weapons and equipment. There's a suit to swim underwater, and there's even a suit to swim in lava, which you'll use to get a stone that you need to open a sealed door. Occasionally, you'll get to temples with a boss inside. These can be rather difficult, so you'll want to try and find the appropriate power-ups before trying to tackle each boss. If you do kill a boss, you'll get a medal, and you're going to need all of them to get to the final area. There's a lot of really cryptic stuff to do, which might seem bad, but, you know, Zelda, Metroid, and Castlevania all had lots of cryptic stuff in them, and they're considered classics, so why isn't this game? Just for one example of a part that's cryptic is when you're supposed to know to keep going back to this person who's sick over and over. So you have to walk to the left, climb up a ladder, walk off the screen, go back down again, down the ladder, back to the person, and you have to do this like 5 times before they eventually turn into a skeleton and you get their power. How the hell are you supposed to know to do that unless you get insanely lucky? That is what I call a Nintendo Power game. And sometimes the controls can get slightly annoying. I don't really like how you select the areas on the map by having to go to a number. It really could have been simplified. And I'd also get annoyed a lot when I'd hit my head trying to jump gaps, but that's pretty minor stuff. Along the way, you meet an old hermit that gives you power-ups, and he gives you the best power in the game, as far as I'm concerned. It's the ability to teleport. It takes forever to walk all over this map, so you're going to be thankful when you get that. It cuts your walking time down immensely. There's a lot of variety to the different areas that you visit, with lots of different backgrounds and a large number of characters to meet. They did a great job creating a huge land with all sorts of stuff to explore. Just watch out when you make it to the very end, because if you don't defuse the bomb correctly, boom! The whole world explodes and it says, "The end." And they don't let you continue. Ever get the bad ending in Bubble Bobble? Well, that's what it's like. Number 4. What would you get if you combined Contra with Life Force? Well, action in New York. But better than Contra, here you get 2 orbiting satellites for additional firepower, and you can program them to fire in any direction that you choose. They can go in an irregular pattern or a fixed position. This game was released after the heyday of the NES when the console was in decline, which is probably why it was so overlooked. It was also named SCAT, Special Cybernetic Attack Team. I find both titles funny. The name Action in New York would make you think that it's going to take place in Manhattan or something, but I don't see anything to indicate that you were in New York City. It looks more like a futuristic spaceship or something, if you ask me. And as for the name SCAT, were they serious with that? Were they not aware SCAT means eating your own shit? Truly the worst title to any game ever. For the NES, the graphics are awesome, and the animation on the enemies and the backgrounds are all really impressive. Though there is one board where you're traveling upwards, and the background scrolls so fast, it makes me kinda sick. If you were a fan of Contra or Super C, you'd love this. The game's best feature is that it can be played with 2 people at the same time, and I always felt that there wasn't enough NES games where it was 2 at once, so I was glad to stumble upon this one. There's not much of a difference in difficulty if you have another person, so playing with a friend adds a big advantage. This is a game I think is great, but just don't play it alone. Number 3, Gun Knack. The plot of this game is essentially everything in the galaxy is going into chaos. Giant rabbits are eating up the cities, dogs and cats are raining from the skies, etc. So all the governments send out a soldier named Gun Knack to save the day, which basically means just blowing up everything that he sees. The gameplay is a lot like other shooters such as Gradius or Super R-Type, but here you're going vertically instead of horizontally. The A button shoots and the B button releases bombs. It couldn't be more simple. There was a ton of shooters released for the NES, and a lot of them were really boring. Life Force was a great shooter, and that's the one that everybody really remembers, but Gun Knack is the other great NES shooter that nobody seems to talk about. The first thing you'll notice is that there's 5 different numbers you can get which indicate the weapon you'll have. Then there's letters, and those show you which type of bomb you'll have. The bombs really come in handy when things start to get too intense. It's impressive that they give you so many different weapons to play with, but it doesn't stop there. If you get 2 of the same weapon, your power will increase, and it has a different animation. You can also upgrade the ship as well, which will let you take more than one hit. I guess what sets this game apart from other shooters that get kinda boring is that this game gives you a ton of variety. The shots you fire are all different and interesting shapes, and the enemies could be anything from a giant cat or a giant rabbit to a bunch of flying logs. Come on, killer logs! How can you not want to play this? It also has difficulty settings, and you can switch it to make your shots bounce off the enemies, which makes it a lot harder. Not that it needs to be any harder. Some of the later stages are insanely difficult, with a billion projectiles being thrown at you all at once. But regardless, the replayability is strong with this one. If you can hunt down a copy, be sure and try out this undersung shoot-'em-up classic. Number 2, Bucky O'Hare. I wasn't too much a fan of the Bucky O'Hare cartoon show. It always seemed to me to be like some sort of Ninja Turtles wannabe.
Captain Bucky O'Hare! Mutants and aliens and toads beware!
The theme song talked about mutants. The enemies were all green toads, and Bucky was even green. Why make a rabbit green? It just left a bad taste in my mouth. I don't think the show was too popular, which is why I don't think many kids bought the NES game. And that's a shame because it's terrific. Each one of Bucky's crew members are taken captive and you have to rescue them. As you get them back, you can hit select and switch between the characters. And each one has a different ability. For example, Blinky can melt ice, and if you charge him up, he'll fly for a limited amount of time. Or there's Deadeye, who can climb walls for a short period of time, like Grant in Dracula's Curse. Since you can switch between characters whenever you want, you'll find that there's certain characters that are better for different situations. For an NES game, that was pretty unique. You won't just be walking right blasting stuff the whole time. This game is filled with puzzles that you'll have to figure out, and it gives the game a lot of substance, which is one of the things that makes it so good. But be warned, it's not easy. There's definitely some classic Nintendo bullshit stages which are really frustrating, but at least you can keep redoing the section as many times as you want until you beat it. One level that pissed me off was this one. It reminds me of Quickman stage in Mega Man 2. You travel downwards and have to avoid being hit by lava. If you make even one mistake, you are dead. So you'll have to do this part over and over until you get the exact pattern down. It's all about trial and error and knowing which route is the right one to take. And speaking of trial and error, then there's the railcar stage. You have to travel rapidly on a cart going along a track, and you have to jump to the next cart before you fall off. Eventually spikes start showing up, and not only do you have to jump off, but you have to duck under the spikes, and it requires split-second reactions. The difficulty is extremely high, so this isn't a game for everyone. It's for people who like a good challenge. Each level ends with a different boss, and they all do different things. The one I hate the most is this alligator. You have to fire at him continually while he shoots missiles at you. Every 5th missile or so, he'll freeze the ground, and if you don't jump, you'll get stuck on the floor and injured. Not to mention, as the water rises, there's spikes up top on the ceiling that'll also kill you if you're not fast enough. This is definitely one occasion where you're going to want to break out that turbo controller. I also want to mention that the soundtrack to this game is really well done. It has some of my favorite music on the NES. You'd have to enjoy memorizing puzzles to like this game, but if you do, it's one of the best for the NES. Even though there's some parts that'll make you want to pull your hair out, I still highly recommend it. So before we get to number 1, I want to give a few shout-outs to a couple games that I nearly considered for this list. I didn't include Metal Storm because I don't think it's quite as obscure as it once was. It's a great game though, and everybody should check it out. A few others: Sweet Home, Little Samson, Mighty Final Fight, Panic Restaurant, and Mr. Gimmick. Those are all good games that I considered, but they're pretty rare, so I figured I wouldn't include anything that's too hard for most people to actually get. And now for number 1, The Guardian Legend. Yes, from the makers of Gun-Knack comes The Guardian Legend. It was a very advanced game for its time. This is a multi-genre game that also combines elements from Zelda and Metroid as well. And after you enter a corridor, the game switches modes where you become a jet, and now it's a vertical shooter. So it's also like Gun-Knack as well, but with a lot more to offer. There's also an experience counter in the upper left. The more monsters you kill, the stronger you get. So any fans of Final Fantasy or Zelda 2 will also dig that aspect. And there's also an exploration mode, which reminds me a lot of the original Legend of Zelda with the top-down perspective. But more than that, backtracking is also possible, where you go to an older area to find a new one. And that's where the Metroid aspect comes into play. It's seriously like getting all your favorite NES games rolled into one. When The Guardian Legend was released, there weren't many other games that had female characters for the lead role, other than Metroid and Miss Pac-Man. And what's cool is, this girl also turns into a plane, so it's even got a touch of Transformers thrown in there. This game has it all. It takes place on a giant spaceship that's on a collision course with Earth. You have to go from area to area to launch the self-destruct sequence and destroy the ship. There's a map system that tells you where you need to go next, which is an improvement over the original Metroid, and that's something that wasn't included until Super Metroid for the SNES. And that's just one thing that shows you how ahead of its time this game was. For an NES game, the graphics are all really good, and the backgrounds are all varied, and there's just a ton of bosses, enemies, and mini-bosses, which keeps the game from ever getting really dull. Not to mention, each area has its own unique background music. But what I love the most about this game are all the upgrades and weapons. You get so many of them, and they all do different things. There's grenades, lasers, fireballs, you name it. And the thing is, you get a huge sense of accomplishment after beating a boss and then going back and killing enemies that were hard before with your newly acquired parts. Oh, you thought you were real hot stuff before, huh? Well, take this! This is a very difficult game, and it's really long, but that's a good thing. You get your money's worth. It's also not so difficult that it's impossible. You'll gradually get stronger, so as long as you keep trying, you'll advance. If you defeat the game, it'll give you a code where you can play through the entire game again in shooter mode only. It's nice to actually get a reward for all your effort. It's kinda like doing the second quest in Zelda. I do have a few minor complaints, but they're pretty trivial. I think the password is too long for one thing. But the game redeems itself because you can always just save your game at one of the save spots, but you will have to be willing to keep your Nintendo turned on. Also, the cover to the game really sucks. It doesn't represent the atmosphere of the game at all, and that may be the reason not many people bought it, which is a real shame. The European version of the game had alternate box art, which is far superior. I think they should have used that everywhere. Oh, and one thing I find kind of funny is that there's these little shops all over the ship, and these little round guys that look like Lolo sell you objects and guns and stuff to help you along in your journey. But why would they help her if her goal is to blow up the ship? Do they have a death wish or something? Another great thing about this game is that it's a common title. It sells for about $2, so anybody can afford it. Well, anyway, next time somebody starts talking about how great Zelda or Super Mario Bros. 3 was for the 10 millionth time, bring up The Guardian Legend or one of these other games. It may be late, but I still say that these obscure NES games deserve their time in the spotlight.